Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 23rd. So, in terms of paper number one, I believe I have returned all of the papers that have been submitted into me. So, if you submitted in a paper and did not receive it back, please contact me. And as you know, you all have the option of rewriting paper number one. I try to write a good number of comments in my commentary, and I ask that you take those comments into account and that you use them for revision and that you submit in your revision along with the original graded copy of the paper so I can compare and contrast the two. And you would get the higher of the two grades. And you have until the ending of the semester, which is sooner rather than later, as we are now headed towards July, believe it or not, though there's still a little bit left to June. And as you know, if you've been following the syllabus, we're approximately a class behind, but that's okay because of the upcoming texts that are two last major texts are Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is a much faster read than the text that we've done before. Now, that said, I do want to caution you that it is a very difficult read, not in terms of the language, but in terms of the incidents that occur. So that what we've got is a slave who, by the name of Harriet Jacobs, who she calls herself Linda Brent, relating the incidents that have occurred to her. So it's nothing short of remarkable that she would have the ability to read and write, which of course was illegal at the time period, and the wherewithal to be able to write down her story. And while it may not necessarily have the level of literary complexity of some of the other works we've read, I can tell you that it is certainly the hardest work we have read because it is so brutal and it is so ugly. And I want you to prepare yourself for what it is you're going to be reading. And we have had slave narratives in the past. Frederick Douglass is a great example. But to get a slave narrative from the female perspective, which is what this class really is about. It's talking about the different roles for female in the 1800s. And we began with talking about the cult of true womanhood and how it was assumed that the ideal female should be passive and should be pure and should be submissive and should be domestic. And we also talked about the fear that women would begin to challenge that, especially if they were exposed to other models in reading, which is why reading is so subversive. It's one of the reasons why we have banned books today because of the possibility of those books leading to readers beginning to question the status quo. And what we've seen thus far are various female authors that have taken different routes to question that status quo. So, that said, we began with Frankenstein and we saw what happens when female is not given voice or agency, and terrible things happen. And we also talked about persuasion when female is given the opportunity to voice her needs and desires, she can find self fulfillment and balance in the sense that it's not a novel that is encouraging female to be extremists. It's a novel that's encouraging female to voice her needs and wants. And we certainly see that when we read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which is probably the um, most out, at least out of the texts that we've talked about thus far this semester, it's been the most clear about the idea of female, and in this instance, a girl as well, a child, rebelling against societal expectations. And you know that I've given the paper topic for both paper number one and for paper number two, in terms of the quote from Cult of True Womanhood about the fear that a book could ruin a girl, and relating that to one of the texts that we are discussing this semester. But you are free to create your own paper topic, but you do need to have that paper topic approved by me, and it does have to be in reference to one of the texts we are reading this semester. And paper number 2 is due at the very ending of the semester, but of course, early papers encouraged. And paper number 2 would be focusing on one of the later texts of the semester. So that would mean Jane Eyre, or it could be Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or it could also be The Awakening. And The Awakening is a shorter text. We end the class the way we began, with Kate Chopin. You'll remember we began the class with Kate Chopin's short story, The Story of an Hour. We end the class with The Awakening, a text that was considered to be so subversive it basically ended Kate Chopin's career and blacklisted her. And it is classified as a novella because it is longer than a short story, but it is shorter than a novel, approximately 100 pages or so. So this is how we are going to be making up some time, because Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is fairly straightforward in terms of its literary elements. But again, it is an incredibly ugly read. So I wanted you to be aware of that. And then when we get to The Awakening, you already had a little bit of a taste of Kate Chopin, and you know how literary she is in her writing with symbolism and metaphor. And she keeps that up throughout the text of The Awakening. And then we have the text that I think, or the author, I should say, that basically straddles both parts of the semester. And that's Emily Dickinson. So I wanted to talk about Emily Dickinson today. And before I get to Emily Dickinson, we were discussing how Jane Eyre has many themes. There are lots of other lenses that you could look at in terms of the elements of that novel. So if you wanted to talk about class, and we know that Persuasion talked about socioeconomic class, and we definitely see that played out in the role of a governess, which would be very different than somebody of, let's say, nobility. And religion, and we see how the author takes an opportunity to critique many of the religious structures in society. We'll see the same, by the way, with Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. The idea of hypocrisy runs through just about all of the texts that we are reading. So you could select a theme and devote a paper topic to it. I just again ask that you approve that idea by me, and that you duplicate what you did in the first paper, in that you are writing approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be, to defend your thesis, your specific position. And what you are doing is using quotation from the text itself in order to be able to support your points. And you're not talking about just what happened. More importantly, you're talking about why those things happened and how they had significance. So do read my comments carefully from the first paper, because even if you decide that you aren't going to rewrite it, certainly you can use that commentary for the second paper. So I think of the first paper as a learning exercise, and then paper number 2, which is due by the ending of the semester, because we basically will be using all of the semester to do our readings. That is basically a duplication of what you did with paper number 1, so you would have already learned how to write a paper. You're just writing about a different text. Now, when it comes to Emily Dickinson, especially if you live in Western Mass, then obviously she comes with a certain cachet, and most people have at least some idea of her biography. Local, from Amherst, and wrote over 1,000 poems, and was known basically for her, some might call it in our time period, agoraphobia, her reluctance to leave her home. But it allowed her the opportunity to be able to devote herself to writing, which was not necessarily considered to be a female profession. And she lived with her family, rather well to do. She was the daughter of a lawyer in Amherst. So that allowed her to be able to devote herself completely to her art. She never married, she never had children. And there's lots of folklore associated with her, and I wanted to begin Emily Dickinson by having you watch a documentary that talks not only about her life, but I think more importantly, it also talks about her poetry, and it'll oftentimes quote her poems as well. And as I said, she's written quite a few poems. I don't expect us to read them all. And what you will learn in the documentary, if you don't already know this, is that her poetry was published after her death, and it was actually edited, and it was changed, dare I say corrected, for things like mechanical irregularities. And of course, that's absolutely absurd when you talk about poetry, because poetry is probably the genre where you could break the most rules in terms of writing. But nevertheless, you want to make sure that you are reading the correct Emily Dickinson, which is fairly easy to do, because if you're reading the correct Emily Dickinson, which was published in the 1950s, it's known as the Johnson edition, which is what I had ordered for us in class if you have the textbook. You know you're reading the correct Emily Dickinson if you see lots of dashes at the endings of lines and if you see irregular capitalization. So if you're not using the text that I had ordered for class, you want to make sure that you are reading a correct Emily Dickinson text. I have included a website from the Poetry Foundation. Poetry Foundation is a wonderful website for finding poetry. And in terms of what I'm going to ask you to do with reading Emily Dickinson after you've watched the documentary and you've learned a little bit about her, for our attendance question, this would be due on Thursday, the 24th. Again, if you need additional time, please let me know. Again, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. I would like you to identify one Emily Dickinson poem, or even just one line from one of Emily Dickinson's poems. So you can leaf through the Johnson edition if you wanted to. You can scroll through the website that I've provided from the Poetry Foundation. You can access your own versions of Dickinson, but again, make sure that you are reading the correct Dickinson, which means that you are reading poetry that's got dashes at the ending of the lines and irregular capitalization. What you will find is that even the scholars, as are interviewed in this biography, indicate that they're oftentimes challenged by Dickinson. So I oftentimes tell my students, don't necessarily feel like you've got to understand all of her poetry. Sometimes just one or two lines. And I'm going to select a poem myself and talk about it next class. I won't tell you now, though. You may or may not select the poem. You've got quite a few options here. So my suspicion is that you'll all be selecting different poems for different reasons. And again, I'm asking for you for the attendance question is to identify a poem or even a line or two in a poem that you found to be particularly powerful and explain why you found it to be so powerful. So I will leave you with watching this documentary, which is 56 minutes long, which will give you a good overview of Emily Dickinson's life, her writing, and also will sample a good number of her poems. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about Dickinson and incidents in the life of a slave girl. Take care. Bye-bye.